he didn't rise alone. Adolf Hitler is often remembered as a single figure, a man who seized power through speeches, propaganda, and force. But behind every rise to power, there is always a system, a network, money, influence, fear. And in Germany, during the 1920s and early 1930s, all three were everywhere. Because before Hitler became dictator, Germany was already collapsing. In 1918, World War I ended. Germany had lost. Its empire was gone, its military defeated, its economy shattered. But the war's end was only the beginning of a deeper crisis. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe conditions on Germany. Territorial losses, military restrictions, and massive reparations. Billions to be paid to the victors. For many Germans, it wasn't just defeat, it was humiliation.
By the early 1920s, the German economy was spiraling out of control. Inflation turned into hyperinflation. Money lost its value almost overnight. People were paid twice a day, so they could spend their wages before prices rose again. Savings disappeared. Middle-class families, once stable, were suddenly poor. Banknotes became worthless. In some cases, people used them as fuel or wallpaper. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was psychological. Trust in the system was breaking down. At the same time, Germany was politically unstable. The Weimar Republic struggled to maintain control. There were uprisings, street violence, clashes between political groups, and one fear stood above all others for many in the elite: communism. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had already shown what could happen. A monarchy overthrown, wealth redistributed, private industry dismantled. For German industrialists and wealthy elites, this was not just a distant event, it was a warning.
Germany was becoming deeply divided. Workers demanded change, better wages, more power, more rights. Meanwhile, business leaders feared losing everything: factories, companies, control. The political center was weakening, and as it weakened, extreme movements began to grow, on the left and on the right. In this chaos, a new voice began to rise: Adolf Hitler. At first, he was not taken seriously. A former soldier, a radical speaker, leader of a small political party. But he had something others did not: clarity, certainty, and a message that resonated with a country in crisis. He spoke of national pride, of strength, of restoring Germany. And most importantly, he positioned himself as a barrier against communism. To many ordinary Germans, Hitler was a voice of anger and change. But to some powerful figures, he represented something else: a potential solution, a man who could mobilize the masses but still be controlled, a leader who could restore order and protect industry. At least that's what they believed. And this is where the story begins to change. Because Hitler didn't rise alone. He was supported, not just by voters, but by people with money, with influence, with power. In the shadows of economic collapse and political fear, a network was forming. Industrialists, bankers, political insiders. Some supported him early, others joined later. But together, they helped shape the path that would bring Hitler to power. And in the next chapter, we begin to uncover who they were. In the early 1920s, the Nazi Party was not powerful. It was small, disorganized, and financially unstable. Meetings were held in beer halls. Pamphlets were printed in limited numbers. The party struggled to survive. At this stage, Hitler was not a national figure. He was a local speaker in Munich,
But even then, one thing was clear. The movement needed money. Politics is never free. Printing materials costs money. Organizing events costs money. Expanding influence costs money. And for a growing political movement, visibility is everything. Posters, newspapers, public rallies. Without funding, the party would remain small and disappear.
At first, the funding was simple. Small donations, membership fees, support from sympathizers. Some supporters contributed modest amounts, others gave more, but it wasn't enough to scale. The party needed larger backing, and that support began to appear, quietly. Munich in the early 1920s was a hub of political tension. It was also a place where networks formed. Former military officers, nationalists, businessmen. Some of them were drawn to Hitler's message, not necessarily because of ideology, but because of what he represented. Order, stability, control over unrest, and most importantly, opposition to communism.
Support did not always come in the form of cash. Sometimes it came as connections, introductions to influential circles, access to rooms where decisions were made. In politics, who you know can be just as important as what you say. And slowly, Hitler was being introduced to people with more resources, more influence, more power. In 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power, the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed. He was arrested. The movement seemed finished, but something unexpected happened. The trial gave Hitler national attention, and prison gave him time. Time to think, time to plan, time to adjust his strategy. After his release, Hitler changed tactics. No more violent seizure of power. Instead, legal methods, elections, political alliances, gradual expansion. But this new strategy required something even more important than before: funding on a much larger scale. For a short time, Germany stabilized, the economy improved, the political system held together, and support for extreme parties declined. But it didn't last. In 1929, the global economy collapsed, the Great Depression, and Germany was hit hard, again. Unemployment soared. Businesses struggled. Banks failed. Millions were desperate. And once again, fear returned. Fear of collapse, fear of instability, fear of communism. This was the moment Hitler had been waiting for, because crisis creates opportunity. As the crisis deepened, support for the Nazi Party grew rapidly. But growth at this scale required resources, large rallies, mass propaganda, nationwide campaigns. And this time, the funding was no longer small. It was becoming serious, structured, strategic. There was no single person funding Hitler, no single company. Instead, there was a network, a group of individuals and interests who saw the potential in the movement. Some supported early, others joined when success seemed possible. Some believed in the ideology, others believed they could control it. But together, they provided what the movement needed most: money. Many of those who supported Hitler did not see him as a threat. They saw him as a tool, a political force that could be used to stabilize the country, to suppress opposition, to protect industry. They believed they could influence him, guide him, control him. History would prove them wrong. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party was no longer a small movement. It was a national force, and behind it, the network of support was growing, larger, more powerful, more organized. In the next chapter, we move deeper into that network, into the world of major industry, major money, and the companies that would become part of the story. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party was no longer a fringe movement. It had become a political force. millions of voters, growing influence, and a real chance at power. But political momentum alone was not enough. To take control of a modern state, you need more than votes. You need industry. You need infrastructure. You need money. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because now, some of Germany's most powerful industries were paying attention. For many industrial leaders, the early 1930s were a time of uncertainty. Factories were slowing down, orders were falling, workers were striking, and political instability threatened everything. But one fear stood above all: communism. The idea that private industry could be taken away, factories nationalized, control lost. For those who owned businesses, this was not theoretical, it was a real risk. And in that environment, Hitler offered something attractive: stability, order, and a strong stance against communism.
In 1933, shortly before Hitler became Chancellor, a critical meeting took place. Leading industrialists and business figures gathered. They discussed the future of Germany, the political direction, and the role they would play in it. Funds were raised. Support was coordinated. This was not about ideology. It was about influence, about shaping the outcome. Once Hitler came to power, the relationship between the state and industry deepened. Rearmament began. Military production expanded rapidly. Factories that had struggled during the Depression were suddenly full of orders. Weapons, vehicles, infrastructure. Industry was no longer just supporting the system. It had become part of it.
One of the most significant industrial players was IG Farben, a massive chemical conglomerate. Its role was critical. Germany lacked natural resources, especially oil. IG Farben developed synthetic fuel, synthetic rubber, materials essential for modern warfare. Without these innovations, Germany's military expansion would have been far more limited. The relationship between the company and the state became increasingly close. Production aligned with military needs, research aligned with strategic goals. Krupp had been a symbol of German industry for decades, a name associated with steel and weapons. During the 1930s, its role expanded again. Artillery, armored components, heavy industry. As rearmament accelerated, companies like Krupp became central to the effort. Production increased, contracts multiplied. The connection between industry and state grew stronger.
Siemens operated in a different space: electrical systems, communications, infrastructure. But its importance was no less critical. Modern warfare depends on coordination, on communication, on systems working together, and companies like Siemens provided the backbone for that infrastructure. It wasn't just heavy industry. Banks, financial institutions, business networks all played a role. Funding did not come from a single source. It came from multiple channels, direct and indirect, visible and behind the scenes. Together, they formed a system that supported rapid expansion. The relationship was not one-sided. Industry supported the regime, and in return, the regime supported industry. Contracts, protection, expansion opportunities. Economic recovery became tied to military growth, and military growth required even more production. It was a cycle, one that accelerated quickly. Many still believed they were in control, that the system could be managed, that political power could be guided. But power does not stay balanced for long, and once consolidated, it rarely returns. Behind the companies were individuals, people who made decisions, who provided access, who influenced outcomes. And in the next chapter, we move from industry to the individuals behind it. Because to understand how Hitler rose, you have to understand who helped open the door. Behind every company, there are people, executives, industrialists, bankers, individuals who made decisions, who chose to support, who chose to engage.
And in the early 1930s, those decisions began to shape the future of Germany. Because systems don't act, people do. Germany's industrial and financial elite was not a single group. It was a network, connected by business, by politics, by shared interests. Many of them had influence long before Hitler appeared. They understood power, they understood risk, and they understood that Germany was changing. The question was not whether change would come, it was who would control it. For some, supporting Hitler was not about belief. It was a calculation, a political investment, a decision made under pressure. If the system collapsed, they could lose everything. If radical movements took control, their position could disappear. So they made a choice: support a movement that promised order, even if that movement carried risk. One of the most well-known early supporters was Fritz Thyssen, an industrialist, a steel magnate. He supported Hitler financially in the early years, not because of every aspect of the ideology, but because he strongly opposed communism. For Thyssen, Hitler represented a force that could prevent a revolution, a force that could protect industry. But like many others, he underestimated what that support would lead to.
Hjalmar Schacht was a different kind of figure, an economist, a banker, a man who understood finance at the highest level. He played a key role in stabilizing Germany's economy in the early years of Nazi rule. His involvement gave credibility, confidence, a sense that the system could function. To many, this made the regime appear manageable, structured, even legitimate. Not everyone gave money directly. Some gave access, introductions to influential circles, connections to decision makers, support within political structures. Influence is not always visible, but it is powerful, and in many cases, it was just as important as funding.
A common belief among many elites was simple: they could control Hitler, use his popularity, direct his actions, limit his power. But power does not work that way. Once it is consolidated, it changes the system around it. And those who thought they were influencing events soon found themselves inside a system they no longer controlled. As support increased, so did momentum. The Nazi Party grew rapidly. Votes increased. Visibility expanded. And with each step forward, the cost of stopping it grew higher. Because once a movement gains momentum, it becomes harder to reverse.
By 1932 and early 1933, Germany stood at a crossroads: political deadlock, economic pressure, public unrest, and behind the scenes, decisions were being made. Deals, agreements, strategic alignments. Some supported out of belief, others out of fear, others out of calculation. But together, they helped create the conditions that would bring Hitler to power. What followed was not sudden. It was the result of years of pressure, years of decisions, years of support. And in the next chapter, we reach the turning point, the moment where all of it, money, influence, fear, and politics, came together and changed history. By 1932, Germany was no longer just unstable, it was breaking. Unemployment had reached millions. Businesses were struggling to survive. The political system was gridlocked. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession. No party could secure lasting control, and every failed government made the crisis worse. Elections were held, again and again, but the results solved nothing. The Nazi Party became the largest political force, but not a majority. They could not govern alone, and other parties refused to cooperate. Germany was stuck, paralyzed, and in that paralysis, pressure began to build behind the scenes.
While the public saw elections, real decisions were being shaped elsewhere. Private meetings, political negotiations, discussions among elites, industrialists, advisors, political insiders. They were searching for a solution, not necessarily the best one, but one that would restore order. For some, the idea became clear. Hitler could be used, given power but limited, placed in a position where he could mobilize support but be controlled by those around him. A strong figure at the front, with experienced figures behind the scenes. It seemed like a compromise, a controlled risk, a way to stabilize the system without giving up full control.
On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It was not a violent takeover. It was a political decision, a legal appointment, made within the system. But it changed everything. Those who supported the decision believed they had found a solution. They believed Hitler could be managed, balanced, restricted. But they misunderstood something fundamental. Power does not stay contained. Once given, it expands. Within weeks, the balance began to shift. Political opposition weakened. Control tightened. Institutions changed. The system that had elevated Hitler was being transformed from within. Step by step, power was consolidated.
By the time many realized what was happening, it was too late. The structures that could have limited power were already weakened. The system had been used and replaced. What had begun as a political strategy had become something else entirely. But gaining power was only the beginning. Because once in control, the relationship between the state and those who supported it would change again. In the next chapter, we look at what happened after power was secured. Who benefited? What changed? And how quickly the system adapted.
Once power is secured, the system changes. Not slowly, not gradually, but quickly. Decisions that once took months are now made in days. Opposition weakens, resistance disappears, and for those connected to the system, new opportunities emerge. Before 1933, Germany was unstable, unpredictable, risky for business. After power was consolidated, that uncertainty began to fade. Orders increased, production restarted, factories that had slowed down came back to life. For many in industry, this looked like recovery. One of the first major shifts was rearmament. Germany began rebuilding its military rapidly. Weapons production expanded, vehicles, aircraft, infrastructure. This created demand, and demand created contracts, large ones.
Companies that had struggled during the economic crisis were now operating at full capacity. Steel production increased, chemical production increased, manufacturing scaled up. The economy appeared to recover. But it was a specific kind of recovery, one tied directly to military expansion. The relationship between the state and industry became more defined. Support had been given, and now benefits were returned. Contracts, stability, access, in many cases, growth. It was not a simple transaction, but it was a system of mutual reinforcement. At the same time, industry became more aligned with the state. Production priorities shifted. Decisions followed national goals. Independent direction became more limited. The system that had once been influenced was now directing. But growth came with a cost that was not always visible at first. The system demanded efficiency, speed, scale, and over time, that demand expanded into areas that carried serious consequences. Labor systems changed, control intensified, and the line between industry and state continued to blur. By the mid-1930s, Germany was no longer in recovery mode. It was accelerating. The economy, the military,
the system itself. And at that point, turning back became increasingly difficult because too much was already invested. Too much had already changed. What had started as support had become integration. Industry, politics, military, all connected, all moving in the same direction. And once a system reaches that level of integration, it no longer depends on individual decisions. It becomes self-sustaining. But understanding what happened is not just about events. It's about meaning, about patterns, about how systems form and how they collapse. Because the story of how Hitler rose to power is not just about the past, it's about how power works. The rise of Adolf Hitler is often told as a simple story, a leader, a movement, a takeover. But in reality, it was far more complex. It wasn't just one man. It was a system, a chain of decisions, a series of choices made by many different people for many different reasons. If you look closely, a pattern begins to appear. Crisis creates fear. Fear creates demand for stability. Stability attracts power, and power attracts support, not always out of belief, often out of calculation. Money alone does not create power, and influence alone is not enough. But when combined, they can accelerate change. They can shape outcomes. They can turn small movements into dominant forces. In Germany, that combination was decisive.
Perhaps the most important lesson is not about support itself, but about miscalculation. Many believed they could control the outcome, that they could guide events, limit power, manage the system. But power, once consolidated, does not behave predictably, and once it grows beyond a certain point, it no longer needs those who helped create it. It's easy to focus on individuals, to assign responsibility to a single figure, but history rarely works that way. Systems are built over time, through decisions, through incentives, through alignment of interests, and once built, they take on a life of their own. Understanding this is not just about the past. It's about recognizing patterns, how power forms, how influence works, how decisions made under pressure can shape the future in ways no one fully expects. Hitler did not rise alone. He was enabled, supported, and underestimated. And in that combination lies one of the most important lessons of the 20th century. History is not just about what happened. It's about understanding how it became possible. History is not just about events. It's about understanding how those events became possible. If you're interested in the deeper stories behind World War II, the decisions, the systems, and the turning points, consider subscribing. And if you found this video valuable, leaving a like helps more than you think. Thank you for watching.